Music theory teachers can constantly challenge their students with the rules on parallel fifths. However, hunting for mistakes can be counterproductive. The question of whether parallel fifths are allowed or forbidden is misguided. Rules governing their use aim at something completely different from right or wrong. You will only understand the meaning of prohibitions and commandments surrounding parallel fifths if you ask the questions differently than usual. Once you understand what it is really about, a door to a deeper understanding of musical composition rules will open. The prohibition states that in polyphonic compositions, two voices may not be led in parallel fifths. However, the rules are complex, depending on the historical textbook. Some limit the prohibition to so-called root note parallels, i.e., the prohibition of leading root notes and fifths of two chords in parallel. But even there is an exception. If an augmented sixth chord, which sounds like a seventh chord on a lowered sixth degree, is followed by a chord on the fifth degree, root note parallels are acceptable, but only as long as they are not found between the outer voices. The rules can be further differentiated. Parallels between diminished and perfect fifths should be prohibited, whereas parallels from perfect to diminished fifths are acceptable. Some say yes, others vehemently disagree. And then there is the prohibition of so-called hidden parallels. These occur when two voices continue in the same direction in a fifth. Here, too, there is no rule without exception. If the upper voice moves up or down in whole tone or semitone steps, hidden parallels are not a problem. In general, however, concealed parallels are problematic because they have the character of so-called horn fifths. This can make you feel a little dizzy. When it comes to fifths, we are dealing with a highly differentiated set of rules. But let's be honest, violating them is hardly so jarring to the ear that one would consider it particularly significant. They are most likely to be noticed by singers who are in the middle of the music and measure what is happening in other voices against their own voice. Most average listeners, especially in instrumental music, are unlikely to be bothered by occasional parallels. So what are these rules really about? Their prohibition is usually justified by irritations in the musical texture. The parallels, it is said, cause the voices to blend too strongly because fifths, after octaves, form the foundation of the overtones and therefore produce the most resonance and blend the most strongly. This also means, incidentally, that octave parallels are even more clearly prohibited. But are we dealing with rules as we know them in mathematics? Not really. Because if an engineer violates a mathematical rule when building a machine, the machine he wants to construct simply won't work. If a speaker violates linguistic rules, we probably won't understand what they are trying to say. If, on the other hand, a composer violates the parallel fifths rule, the result is still music, just music that may not sound quite as convincing to particularly critical listeners. Musical rules have a completely different character than mathematical or linguistic rules. They are not absolute commands or prohibitions, but rather taste-oriented recommendations. Linguist Ray Jackendoff and composer Fred Lertle summed this up succinctly in their influential book Generative Theory of Tonal Music. They refer to these as preference rules. The hard rules of linguistics or mathematics take the form: if A is the case, then you must do B. Otherwise, your system will collapse. Preference rules work differently. They say that if A is the case, it is advantageous to do B. But perhaps also C or D. The criterion is individual taste. So what is happening here? Why do rules on parallel fifths provoke so much controversy? In fact, as we have just seen, it is not a question of right or wrong in the application of compositional rules, but rather of which acoustic textures are to be created. To illustrate this, let us take a closer look at 3 examples and develop a metaphor for the use of fifths from a completely different field of creative work. In the Middle Ages, the first steps toward polyphony were doublings of voices in parallel intervals, preferably fifths. The fifths created an archaic, resonant sound that made the spiritual message sensually tangible. The result was a musical texture that can be compared to earthy, stony landscapes in the realm of material textures. Western polyphony thus began with the exact opposite of a prohibition on parallel fifths. The effect that was to be achieved can be described as a uniform texture that seeks to express not human emotions and linguistic similarity, but the foundation of our existence. To this end, let us briefly consider the nature of the overtone series from which the intervals of tonal music are derived. As we have just seen, the first overtones are the octave, fifth, and fourth. At a higher level are the consonant thirds and sixths, followed by the level of dissonant seconds. Octaves, fifths and fourths have a static but strongly resonant character due to their simple vibration ratios. This makes them suitable as a metaphor for the basis of our existence, an impersonal, unpopulated, archaic landscape in which God, but not man, reveals himself. The right texture for the sacred music of the Middle Ages. Thirds and sixths sound softer and more nuanced in their expression. They are also more flexible in their intonation and therefore represent a world of human self-awareness, freedom, and emotions. If we stick with the metaphor of material textures, they can be compared to soft and flexible fabrics, such as grass or wool. Thirds and sixths dominated music during the Baroque and Classical periods, an era in which the Enlightenment placed humans, rather than God, at the center. The musical structures of these periods can be understood as the development of uniform textures from defining thirds and sixths, in which prominent parallel fifths must have seemed like a throwback to earlier times. To stick with our image of flexible materiality, they act like knitting mistakes in an otherwise uniform wool blanket. In fact, some music historians explain the parallel avoidance rule as a means of distinguishing oneself from earlier eras. In this musical context, parallel fifths are not a mistake in the syntactic or semantic structure of the music, but a mistake in the texture that is to be created. A brief digression. Among the philosophers who embodied the spirit of the 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer stands out. In his magnum opus, The World as Will and Idea, he develops a metaphysics of music that is strikingly similar to our explanations. In paragraph 52 he writes, "Bass is thus, for us, in harmony what unorganized nature, the crudest mass, upon which all rests and from which everything originates and develops, is in the world. The deep bass moves most slowly, the representative of the crudest mass. In the melody, in the high, singing, principal voice leading the whole and progressing with unrestrained freedom, in the unbroken significant connection of one thought from beginning to end representing a whole, I recognize the highest grade of the objectification of will, the intellectual life and effort of man." The bass creates its material in the first overtones of the overtone series, octave, fifth, fourth. The regions in which the melody is usually situated, alto and soprano, correspond to the regions of thirds and seconds. As the 19th century progressed, composers increasingly began to move away from a uniform philosophy of style and texture and to mix different textures, just as philosophers later moved away from all-encompassing, uniform systems of world explanation. This is most clearly evident in the works of Debussy and Ravel, who were also masters of instrumentation, the supreme discipline of texture design. In their piano and chamber music works, they mixed a variety of techniques, as exemplified by Ravel's string quartet. At the beginning of the third movement, he mixes pentatonic scales and parallel fifths to create a pluralistic texture that could be compared to quilts or patchwork. Okay, our socio-historical and philosophical interpretation of harmony in the Middle Ages, Classical period, and Impressionism is anything but a scientifically sound theory. But that wasn't the point. In this video, we simply wanted to show how the use of interval material influences the textures of music. Bach created a groundbreaking texture in his C major prelude from the well-tempered clavier in an astonishing way. It anticipated the sounds and structures of jazz, as I show in this video. Check it out. And subscribe to our channel because the best is yet to come. And write in the comments how convincing you find our texture metaphor. We love debates.